The day we buried my son, my daughter-in-law handed me an eviction notice. Not literally a piece of paper with a stamp and a signature, just words, spoken in the kitchen of the house I built with my own hands 41 years ago, while the casserole dishes from the neighbors were still warm on the counter and the sympathy cards hadn't even been opened yet. She said, "I think it's best if we figure out the living situation sooner rather than later." I was still wearing my black tie. I hadn't even taken off my coat. My son's name was Daniel. He was 43 years old. He coached Little League on Saturday mornings and made the best smoked brisket I've ever tasted and called me every Sunday without fail, even when we didn't have much to say, even when we'd just talk about the weather or whatever game was on. He died on a Tuesday in March on Route 9 when his truck went off the road and down an embankment into the creek. The police said it was a single vehicle accident, no other cars involved, no ice on the road, no alcohol in his system. They said the brakes had failed. I didn't know that yet. Standing in my kitchen in my black tie while my daughter-in-law talked about living situations. I just knew my son was gone, and I couldn't feel my hands, and the coffee someone had made was sitting in the pot getting cold and nobody was drinking it. "I understand this is hard," she said. She was already looking at her phone. "But the house is in Daniel's name and mine jointly, and I need to start thinking about what comes next. I'd appreciate it if you could be out within the week." A week. Daniel had been in the ground for 4 hours. I looked at her. I'd never particularly warmed to her. She'd come into Daniel's life 7 years ago. All polish and ambition, working in real estate development, always talking about equity and leverage and market timing. Daniel had been dazzled by her. I wanted to be happy for him. I tried. But there was something behind her eyes that I could never quite name. Some calculation running constantly that never fully switched off. Even when she smiled, even when she laughed, I said, "All right." That was it. That was all I said. She blinked. I think she expected an argument. I think she'd prepared for one. Instead, I set down my coffee cup, walked down the hall to the room I'd been sleeping in since my wife passed 8 years ago, and I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I thought about my son. I thought about the brakes. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the full picture. I'm 71 years old. I spent 34 years as a general contractor in central Pennsylvania. I built houses. I built additions. I built barns. I poured foundations. I framed walls. I climbed roofs in August heat and January cold, and I knew every nail and joist in every structure I ever touched. I retired 6 years ago when my knees told me they were done. And I moved in with Daniel partly because the house my wife and I had owned was too big and too quiet, and partly because Daniel asked me to. He asked me to. That matters. He came to me and said, "Dad, I've got the space and I'd like the company. The guest room's yours if you want it." He meant it. Daniel always meant what he said. The house was a 4-bedroom colonial on about 2 acres outside of Harrisburg. Daniel had bought it before he met his wife, paid a fair price for it, put work into it over the years. When they married, he added her name to the deed. That was Daniel. Generous to a fault, always assuming the best of people. She moved in and immediately started talking about renovations. The kitchen wasn't modern enough. The master bath needed to be expanded. The landscaping was dated. Daniel went along with most of it because that's who he was. And I kept my opinions to myself because it wasn't my house and it wasn't my marriage. But I watched. I watched how she talked about the property like it was an asset on a spreadsheet rather than a home. I watched how she filed away information, what things were worth, what the lot could be subdivided into, what comparable properties in the area had sold for. I watched how her attention sharpened whenever the topic of Daniel's life insurance came up. He had a policy through his employer, $250,000. She brought it up once at dinner, casually, the way you might mention the weather. "Have you thought about increasing the coverage? It's really not enough given our situation." Daniel laughed it off. I didn't say anything. A month before he died, Daniel called me on a Sunday like always, but his voice was different, tighter. He said he'd been having trouble with the truck. The brakes felt soft, he said. He'd taken it to his regular mechanic, and the mechanic said everything looked fine, but it still didn't feel right. He was going to bring it somewhere else for a second opinion. I told him to do that. I told him not to drive it until he did. He said he would. He didn't. 3 weeks later, my son was dead and I was sitting on the edge of a bed in his house being asked to leave within the week. I took 8 days. I didn't rush. I packed what was mine. My tools in the garage, my books, my photographs, the quilt my wife made before she got sick, and I put them in my truck and I drove to my brother-in-law's house in York, where he had a spare room and didn't ask too many questions. I was quiet about it. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't cause a scene. She probably thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. I've been a contractor for 3.5 decades. I know vehicles the way I know buildings, not mechanically, not like a certified technician, but structurally. I know how things are built and how they fail and what the difference looks like between a part that wore out and a part that was helped along. The morning after I arrived at my brother-in-law's house, I called Daniel's mechanic, the one he'd taken the truck to the month before. I asked him what he'd actually found. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about calling someone. The brake line hadn't been cut, nothing that obvious, but there was a fitting on the rear brake line that had been loosened. Not all the way, just enough that under sustained pressure, over enough miles, the fluid would slowly weep out until there wasn't enough left to stop the truck reliably on a downhill grade. It would look like wear. It would look like a fitting that had vibrated loose over time. It would look like an accident." The mechanic said he hadn't flagged it, because at the time he couldn't be certain it wasn't just wear, but it had been bothering him. The fitting was in a location that was hard to access accidentally. It would have taken someone who knew what they were looking for and knew where to look. I asked him if he'd be willing to talk to someone official about what he'd seen. He said yes. I didn't go to the police first. That's not how I did it. I went to a lawyer, not a criminal lawyer, a civil attorney in Harrisburg who a friend of mine had used in a property dispute years back. A woman named, and I want to be precise here because she matters, a woman who had been practicing for 28 years and who listened to me for 90 minutes without interrupting and then said very calmly, "You need to do 3 things, and you need to do them in the right order." The first thing was documentation. Everything I knew, everything the mechanic knew, everything I'd observed over 7 years about my daughter-in-law's relationship to money and property and my son's assets, the life insurance, the deed, the renovation receipts she'd been paying for with a credit card in her name alone, which seemed odd given that they had joint accounts, dates, amounts, conversations I remembered. I'm not a writer, but I wrote it all down. The second thing was the life insurance company. Before she filed the claim, and she would file, I was certain of that. The lawyer advised me to contact the insurer's fraud investigation unit directly. Not to make accusations, she said, just to reflect that there were questions about the circumstances of the accident that law enforcement might be examining, just to suggest they might want to hold off on processing any payout until the situation was clearer. I made that call the same afternoon. The third thing was the Pennsylvania State Police. I had the mechanic's statement. I had my own written account. I had a 7-year pattern of behavior that, taken individually, might mean nothing, but laid out in sequence, told a very specific story about a woman who had married my son, spent years positioning herself to benefit from his death, and then, I believe, made sure that death happened on her timeline. I want to be careful here. I am not a prosecutor. I'm a 71-year-old retired contractor sitting in my brother-in-law's spare room. Everything I've just told you is what I believe happened, based on what I saw and what I've been told. The investigation is ongoing. I will let the people whose job it is to find the truth do their jobs. But I want to tell you what I felt when I walked out of the state police barracks that afternoon and got into my truck and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before I could drive. I felt my son with me. I know how that sounds. I'm not a sentimental man. My wife always said I expressed emotion like a man trying to pass a kidney stone. But sitting in that parking lot, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been locked tight since the moment I got the phone call about the accident, and I said out loud, to nobody, to Daniel, I didn't let it go. I put the truck in drive, and I went back to my brother-in-law's house, and I ate dinner and I went to sleep. 6 weeks after I moved out of Daniel's house, 2 investigators from the state police knocked on my daughter-in-law's door. I know because one of Daniel's neighbors, a retired teacher who'd lived next door for 15 years and who'd always had a soft spot for my son, called me that evening. She said there were 2 cars in the driveway she didn't recognize, and she thought I should know. I thanked her and I hung up and I sat in the chair by the window in my brother-in-law's spare room, and I looked out at the street, and I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. People expect you to feel triumphant, or vindicated, or some version of satisfied. I felt tired. I felt the specific exhaustion of a man who has been holding something heavy for a very long time, and has finally been allowed to set it down, but whose arms still ache from the weight of it. The life insurance claim had been suspended pending investigation. That I knew from the lawyer. The rest I'm still waiting on. There's a thing people say when they hear a story like this. They say, "I can't believe she did that at the funeral." And I understand the impulse. I do. But here's what I've learned at 71. Having built things and lost things, and watched the people I love leave this world one by one. What someone does at the worst moment is who they are. The mask comes off. The performance ends, and you see exactly what you're dealing with. My daughter-in-law stood in my kitchen while my son was barely cold in the ground and thought about real estate. That told me everything. What I did about it, going quietly, gathering the pieces, making the calls in the right order, not screaming or threatening or making a scene, that's who I am. My wife used to call it stubbornness. Maybe she was right, but stubbornness kept my son's truck on the road for years before someone decided he'd lived long enough. And stubbornness is what put investigators at that door. Daniel deserved that. He deserved a lot more. He deserved to be coaching Little League this Saturday. He deserved to keep calling me on Sundays. He deserved to smoke another brisket and eat it at the table in the house he bought and filled with his own life. But he got a father who paid attention, who noticed the things that didn't add up, who knew that a brake fitting in that location doesn't loosen on its own, who wrote it all down and walked into a lawyer's office and then a police barracks and said, "My son did not die by accident. I don't know what happens next. I'm not going to pretend I do." Justice moves the way it moves, slow, imperfect, frustrating in ways that would try the patience of a saint. And I am emphatically not a saint. But she underestimated me. That's the thing she got wrong. She looked at a 71-year-old man in a black tie who nodded and packed his bags and drove away without a word. And she thought that was the end of the story. I've been building things my whole life. I know how to read a structure. I know where the load-bearing walls are. I know what it looks like when something is about to come down. The house my son built is still standing. His name is still on that deed, next to hers, and neither of them is going anywhere until a court says different. I made sure of that too. The lawyers are still working. The investigators are still working. The insurance company is still working. And I am still here, in my brother-in-law's spare room, eating dinner, going to sleep, waking up in the morning. That's the only thing I know how to do. You keep going. You put one foot in front of the other. You remember who you're doing it for and you don't stop. Daniel called me every Sunday for 20 years. The phone is quiet now, and that quiet is the loudest thing I've ever heard. But I didn't let it go. I want him to know that. I didn't let it go.